এয়ার ইন্ডিয়ার AI 171 ড্রিমলাইনার টেক অফের মাত্র 30 থেকে 59 সেকেন্ডের মধ্যেই ঘটে গেল ভয়াবহ দুর্ঘটনা। যাত্রী, কেবিন ক্রু ও পাইলট মিলিয়ে মোট 242 জনের মধ্যে মাত্র একজন যাত্রী প্রাণে বেঁচে যান। সাম্প্রতিক অতীতে এত বড় বিমান দুর্ঘটনার নজির কিন্তু নেই গোটা বিশ্বে। আর ড্রিমলাইনারের মতো বিমান এভাবে দুর্ঘটনার মধ্যে পড়েনি। আর তাই বারবার এই বিমান দুর্ঘটনার সম্ভাব্য দিকগুলি নিয়ে শুরু হয়েছে চুলচেরা বিশ্লেষণ। কিন্তু বোয়িং কোম্পানির বিভিন্ন প্লেন সারা বিশ্ব জুড়ে নানান রকম দুর্ঘটনা বা নানান রকম ত্রুটি বিচ্যুতির বিষয়ে অভিযোগের শিরোনামে উঠে এসেছে। এভিয়েশন বিশেষজ্ঞ ক্যাপ্টেন স্টিভ এয়ার ইন্ডিয়ার বিমান দুর্ঘটনার পিছনের তত্ত্বগুলি নিয়ে আলোচনা করেছেন। সম্ভাব্য ডানার ফ্ল্যাপ সমস্যার উপর বিশেষ নজর দিয়েছেন তিনি পরামর্শ দিয়েছেন যে বিমানটি ওড়ার কিছুক্ষণের পরেই লিফট হারিয়ে ফেলেছিল, ল্যান্ডিং গিয়ারটি নিচেই পড়েছিল। বিশেষজ্ঞ তিনটি প্রধান সম্ভাবনা বিবেচনা করেছেন। সেগুলি হলো ডুয়েল ইঞ্জিন বিকল হওয়া, মানে দুটি ইঞ্জিনই নষ্ট হয়ে যাওয়া, ভুল ফ্ল্যাপ সেটিংস অথবা অকালে ফ্ল্যাপ প্রত্যাহার, টেক অফ করার পর থেকে দুর্ঘটনাগ্রস্ত হয়ে আছড়ে পড়ার আগে পর্যন্ত ভাইরাল ভিডিওটি চালিয়ে দুর্ঘটনার সম্ভাব্য কারণগুলি বিবেচনা করেছেন তিনি। স্টিভের মতে বিমানটি ওড়ার কিছুক্ষণের মধ্যেই লিফট হারিয়ে ফেলেছিল, যার জেরে টেক অফের পর যতটা উচ্চতায় ওঠার কথা ছিল বিমানটির ততটা ঠিক উঠতে পারেনি। এছাড়া টেক অফের পর ল্যান্ডিং গিয়ার খোলা থাকার বিষয়টিও উল্লেখ করেছেন তিনি। ক্যাপ্টেন স্টিভ কি বলেছেন শোনাবো।
Take a look at what we see, and I'm going to stop it here as the airplane comes into the frame. The airplane looks to be kind of normal, but what we do know is this: the landing gear is still down. Now, this airplane is well beyond the point of rotation and climb out where they would have raised the gear. That's done at about 50 feet off the ground. And so more on that in a minute. What we also see is both engines. We don't know if they're producing thrust, but what we don't see out of the engines is any sort of flame, any sort of sparks. We don't see any indication that they're not operating normally. Now, everybody's been talking about a power loss, and I've watched a bunch of videos and people on the different channels talking about this. And they say, well, it was a power loss, and that's why the airplane descended and crashed. Let me be specific with this. This was a loss of lift. It could have been caused by a power loss. So that's theory number one, is that they lost power on both engines. That caused the loss of lift. The airplane stopped flying. It started flying at one point. It was flying normally as the nose lifted off. Before they raised the gear, the airplane lost lift and stopped flying. So what would have caused that? Well, if both engines failed, it was just one of two things. Either they ran through a flock of birds and basically destroyed both engines at once. The reason I don't think that's a likely theory is we don't see any birds in the picture. It would have had to be a lot of birds to foul out both engines, and we don't see any indications coming out of the back of the engine that happened. You'd see flames, you'd see sparks, you'd see something as those engines were kind of coming apart. It's smoke at a minimum, so you don't see any of that stuff. It looks as though the engines are intact and they're running. They could have both flamed out because of fuel contamination. Now, that's the one thing that both engines would have in common, is the fuel. The problem with that theory, at least in my opinion, is that as they pushed up the power to go down the runway, they would have had the indications of a sputtering engine if the fuel had been contaminated. There's no indication that they did. They rolled down the runway, and I'll show you that video in a minute. They rotate at the normal speed. They take a nose-up attitude, which is really normal for that airplane at that speed. Everything else happens after that. So I don't think they lost power on the engines. Now, we could find out in a day or two. That's exactly what happened, and that's what caused the loss of lift. But that's theory number one. Theory number two is that they took off without the flaps out. They took up with flaps up. The problem with that, and it would be indicative of the way the airplane kind of wallowed into the air and then came back down. The problem with that theory is this: they would have had to get through two complete checklists and not put the flaps down, because two checklists on that airplane, and they're electronic checklists, they're integral to the airplane. It's not like a paper checklist that you hold. So the airplane literally will not let you taxi out and take off without the flaps deployed properly for that weight and that airport that you're at. All that stuff is determined ahead of time. So they would have had to manually override both of those checklists, then for some unexplained reason, take the runway. And once you put your power up in a 787, just like my 777, once you put the power up, the airplane knows you intend to go flying. If you're not configured for flight, in other words, your flaps are not deployed, it makes a racket. A big red light comes up and says config warning, and then both master caution lights in front of both pilots flash. And then a horn goes off, and it's deafening. It's inconceivable that they would have continued on with that takeoff roll with a configuration warning in front of them just to rotate and then flounder into the community off the end of the runway. So is it possible that that was what happened? It is possible. Same as with the power loss. Anything is possible here. We don't have all the details. The airplane has plenty of lift over the wings, has plenty of thrust going on, and now those big landing gear, the drag devices now have been brought up into the airplane, and man, it takes off like a rocket. That part never happens. Right here, as we're looking at this airplane, the gear should be coming up into the airplane. It never does. Let me play it a little bit longer, and then I'm going to tell you why I think it didn't. Right there is a point where the pilot fly would normally bring the airplane up to about 12 degrees nose up. The gear should be almost completely up into the airplane at this point. It hasn't budged an inch. You're going to see on a 787 the ends of the wings start to bend a little bit. They usually bend a lot more than this airplane. Why? Because as the airplane's picking up speed and it's picking up lift over those wings, those composite wings really bend. That is an indication, a visual indication, they're really getting a lot of lift. This 787 is not getting a lot of lift right now. But nothing's going on with the engines as far as I can see. Now, let me continue with this. At this point, watch the nose. It starts to go over right there. It starts to come back over. Why is it doing that? Here's what I think happened. And again, folks, this is just my opinion. This is a theory, that one theory among many. Any of the others I could have shared with you up to this point could be absolutely right. But why do I think this one is more likely than the other two? Here's why. I think the pilot flying said to the co-pilot, gear up at the appropriate time. I think the co-pilot grabbed the flap handle and raised the flaps instead of the gear. If that happened, and this is a big if that happened, this explains a lot of why this airplane stopped flying, why the lift over the wings died. Because at that point now, the flaps are retracting, all that extra lift you're producing in the wings goes away. You're already slow, you already got the power pushed up all the way. This airplane's as heavy as it's ever going to be in this flight, and you still got those great big landing gear out there producing all sorts of drag. This is a bad combination at this point. You see the nose now start to come over. Now, why would the nose come over? Because the airplane is trying to create as much lift as it can over those wings. And if the flaps are coming up, it's going to nose over to get even more airflow over those wings. That's going to be a very, very uncomfortable feeling for the pilot at the controls. Why? Because he's losing airspeed and he's going to begin to lose altitude now. Remember, he thinks the gear has come up. He might not know that the flaps came up. He just sees a motion over next to him.
লাইক কমেন্ট শেয়ার করতে ভুলবেন না। দেখতে থাকুন আজ তাক বাংলা। সাবস্ক্রাইব করুন আমাদের ইউটিউব চ্যানেলটি, বেল আইকন প্রেস করুন নোটিফিকেশন পেতে।